Hello, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering Commander deck profile video. Today, the deck that I am going to be profiling is one that I made specifically because I wanted a deck with not one, not two, but 3 commanders in it. Sort of. So, you see, with the partner mechanic, you can have a deck with 2 commanders, and that's what I did here. We've got Galanra, Caller of Wirewood, and Brynolin the Moon Kraken, but I also went one step further and included Keruga the Macro Sage as the deck's companion. So, yes, maybe it's more like 2.5 commanders, but it's 3 cards, and it is a lot of fun to have a crowded command zone like that. So, yeah, that is what I did, and as always, with my deck profiles, I am going to go into excruciating detail over every card in this deck. I will break it up section by section to make it a bit easier to navigate, and then once I'm done all that, I will sort of explore how you might want to play this deck and overview some of the combos and things that you can do. So, we're gonna move all this out of the way, and we're gonna get started. Now, first of all, let's take a look at the commanders themselves. So, as I've already shown you, we have Galanra here, who is 3 mana to play, a 1/2, and taps for green, and when you spend that mana to cast a spell with converted mana cost 6 or greater, you draw a card. So it's kind of useful just to have Galanra in the command zone so that you always have access to a mana dork and a way to draw cards if you're playing something of a large enough size. So Galanra will not win you any games on its own, but it's still a useful card to have there. Brynolin, the Moon Kraken, is my second commander, my second partner here. Now, Brynolin is 8 to play, a 6/8, and when it enters the battlefield, or whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 6 or greater, I think you're seeing a theme here, you can return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Now, Brynolin, of course, is worth 8, as I said, so at the very least, if you already have Galanra, you can eventually play Brynolin and draw a card off of it and then return something to its owner's hand. So they kind of feed into each other that way. Otherwise, Brynolin is just a very expensive bit of removal that you have in the command zone, so it's kind of handy to always have access to it at the very least. And, of course, because those are my commanders, here we have our companion, Keruga the Macro Sage. So, companions are a fun mechanic that force you to build your deck in weird ways. So for Keruga to be your companion, your starting deck can't contain anything besides land with mana value less than 3. So everything is pretty big. And, of course, with the partner commanders who want to play big things, Keruga is right at home. Now, unfortunately, Keruga is not mana value 6, he is only 5, and is a 5/4. But when Keruga enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each other permanent you control with mana value 3 or greater. So, Keruga is just your sort of ace in the hole to draw a whole bunch of cards if you need gas at any time during the game. So between Keruga drawing you cards, Brynolin maybe removing stuff for you, and Galanra adding mana to your mana pool and drawing cards as well, you've got a cool little toolbox of various effects at your disposal from the command zone. So you always should have something to do that will help you progress your game. Now, I say progress your game, but everything in the deck has to be pretty big, so what do you do for the first couple turns of the game? Well, there are ways that you can kind of cheat around that high mana value requirement. For one thing, we've got Rift Sower here, which is worth 3 to play, but you can suspend it for 2 turns for only 1 mana, so it's something you can do on turn 1. Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy, is one of these adventure cards, and there's a lot of adventure cards that have cheap costs, even though the creature is more expensive. So Kellen is worth 4 mana, but you can tail the suspect for 2, and investigate and play an additional land that turn, so this does also help you ramp. Kellen himself has flying and vigilance, and when it attacks, you destroy target artifact, and if you controlled that permanent, you draw a card. But that is usually less important than being able to play an additional land. Like Beanstalk Worm, which is a 5/4 with reach, but for 2 mana you can play an additional land this turn. Hey, that's good. Brazen Borrower. Now this is where your opponents might not be expecting you to play cards. Petty Theft is a 2 mana instant that returns a non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So if you've got nothing else to do, well, maybe you can stop your opponents from doing stuff. Otherwise, Brazen Borrower is a 3 mana with flash and flying and can only block creatures with flying. But still, you can cast that from exile with flash, so maybe you want to do that too. Stormkeld Vanguard is a 6 mana creature that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It's a 6/7. But Bear Down is only worth 2 mana and you destroy target artifact or enchantment. Hey, nothing wrong with that. Horned Lock Whale is another 6-drop with like flash and ward 2, and it enters tapped unless it's your turn. It's a 6/6. But instant speed Lagoon Breach, 2 mana. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on top or bottom of their library. So it's more instant speed removal at 2 mana. Very good. Balluna's Gatekeeper is similar, 6 mana, 6/5. But entry denied is only a sorcery, but, you know, you take what you can get, really. Return a creature you don't control with mana value 3 or less to its owner's hand. It's something. And the Colossal Sky Turtle, oh, this is a favorite of mine. It's like 7 mana, it's a 6/5, flying ward 2, but it has 2 different channel abilities. One of them is 3 mana, so whatever, you could have 3 mana cards to begin with, but you can discard it to return a card from your graveyard to your hand, which is very useful. Or for 2 mana, you discard it and return target creature to its owner's hand. So this is another, like, 2 mana unsummon. It's not good, but it is something that you can do for 2 mana, and in this deck, that counts for a lot. We also have, out of the creatures, we have Search for Tomorrow, which is a sorcery. 3 mana, search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, not tapped, and then shuffle your library. But just like the elf at the beginning, you can suspend this for 2 turns for only 1 mana. Hey, that's good. Raven Form, you can foretell this one for 2 mana and then cast it for 1 blue on a later turn. That's not bad. It is a sorcery. You exile an artifact or creature and its controller makes a bird token. But it's some nice, cheap exile there if you can foretell it first. Otherwise, 3 mana sorcery, that's not the worst. Sundering Vitae, this one has Convoke. So if you've got creatures in play already, then they can make this cheaper, and it's an instant destroy an artifact or enchantment. It's pretty good, really. Careful Cultivation. This one is, this is a weird one. It's a 3 mana aura. But the enchanted permanent, as long as it's a creature, it gets +1/+3, has reach, and taps for double green, which is sometimes relevant, but its channel ability, again with the channel, 2 mana, discard it, make a 1/1 human monk that taps for green. There you go, your 2 mana Llanowar human. Again, it's not good, but it's something. And Incubation Incongruity, here we've got a split card. You can play Incubation for 1, and look at the top 5 cards of your library, reveal a creature from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. Or Incongruity, which is exile target creature. Hey, that's pretty good. The creature's controller makes a frog lizard 3/3, but instant speed removal, especially exile removal, is never a bad thing to have, so this is a nice versatile card to have as well. And again, 1 mana for this half, so it's something you can do in the early game, and it's kind of difficult to find that stuff sometimes. As I'm sure you can imagine, this deck needs a lot of mana to function, so this is a whole stack of mana accelerant in one way or another. So we're gonna start with the Gyre Engineer, which is a 3 mana 1/1. It taps for a green and a blue. And I use this card, first of all, because tapping for 2 mana at once is pretty good, but also this is blue, and that is relevant for later. Weaver of Currents is a 3 mana 2/2, taps for double colorless, so again, it's a nice boost to have on turn 3 if you can get it out there. But again, this card is blue. Troyan, the Gutsy Explorer, is another blue and green, 3 mana 1/3. It taps for a green and a blue, but you can only use that mana to cast spells with mana value 5 or greater, or with X in their mana costs. But you can also use it to draw a card and discard a card, so this is a nice versatile creature to get out there if you can. And also we have a couple cost reducers, because again, there is heavy cost to some of the cards in this deck, so it's nice to reduce that. This here is Gore Claw, the Terror of Kal Sisma, 4 mana 4/3. Creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. That is huge. And whenever it attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and trample, so you could even use this to overrun your opponent with certain things that we will see later. Thrix, the Sudden Storm, is 5 mana 4/5, flash and flying, and spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater cost 1 less and can't be countered. Again, very nice, especially if you're trying to cast multiple things in one turn, which does happen. Now, besides reducing costs, we can also play additional lands, and here we have Azusa, Lost But Seeking, the classic, 3 mana 1/2, play 2 additional lands on each of your turns. Don't mind that. And Wayward Swordtooth, which is a 3 mana 5/5, it has Ascend, and if you haven't ascended, it can't attack or block, but you can play an additional land on each of your turns. And as a 5/5, that does trigger some other effects as well. Oracle of Moldea, 4 mana 2/2, play an additional land on each of your turns, but you can also play with the top card of your library revealed and play lands from the top of your library. So this just gets more and more lands into play, and maybe you are starting to see a bit of a theme to this deck. I say that as we go into other creatures that get you more land, like the Topiary Stomper, 3 mana 4/4. Again, 4 power is relevant for some things, has Vigilance. Enters the battlefield, search for a basic land, put it into play tapped, then shuffle. Can't attack or block unless you control 7 or more lands. That's surprisingly less important than it having 4 power to begin with, and getting a land, of course. Quandrix Cultivator is worth a very interesting mana cost there, 4 in total. It's a 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic forest or island, put it onto the battlefield untapped, and then shuffle. So this one is a turtle druid, which is fun, but this one is not as good as some other cards with similar effects. There's, like Wood Elves for 3 mana. But this card is blue. And I've brought that up a couple times now. Blue cards are important for something later. We also have Ulvenwald Hydra, which is a 6 mana. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control. It has reach. And when it enters, search your library for any land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. So this is a 6-drop, which is good for both of our commanders, as you've seen, and it gets massive. Beanstalk Giant. Like Ulvenwald Hydra, power and toughness are equal to your lands. This is worth 7 mana. but it's adventure half. The Fertile Footsteps for 3. Search your library for a basic land, put it into play untapped, and shuffle. It's not bad. I'm not 100% sold on this one. It could probably be something else, but it's not bad, and it does fit what the deck is trying to do. And then we have Sky Shroud Claim, one of the best ramp spells. 4 mana, search for 2 forests. They don't have to be basic. Put them onto the battlefield untapped and shuffle. There's nothing wrong with that. Map of the Frontier is a newer one. 4 mana, search for 2 basic lands or deserts. Put them onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. Believe me, searching for those deserts, that is a big deal. And Hour of Promise is 5 mana, but you search for any 2 lands, put them onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. Then if you control 3 or more deserts, you make a couple zombies. That usually doesn't happen, but searching for any 2 lands in the deck, let me just tell you, sometimes that can win you the game. And if you haven't figured out what this deck is trying to accomplish yet, then yeah, this is a big hint. Alright, now let's take a bit of a look at the cards that really make this deck run. This is all the card draw, because you need to draw a lot of cards to keep going. So we will start with Outcaster Trailblazer, which is a 3 mana 4/2. It has plot for 3, so you can plot it on one turn and then play it for free another turn. When it enters, you add a mana of any color, so that's kinda cool, gives you a small rebate on itself, and whenever another creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. And there's a lot of 4 or greater power. Like Thunderous Snapper, which is a 4/4 for 4, whenever you cast a spell with mana cost 5 or greater, you draw a card. And this is a very color-heavy cost to play this card, but it's blue, and that's important. We also have Primordial Sage, which is a 6-drop for your commanders to go with. It's a 4/5. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may draw a card. And Soul of the Harvest is another 6-drop, 6/6 with Trample. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. And here we have an enchantment, Garruk's Uprising, 3 mana. If you already control a creature with power 4 or greater, when you play it, you draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. So power 4 or greater is something that comes up a lot in these cards, so I think you can see now why I use Topiary Stomper, right, instead of Wood Elves or something similar. Maybe it's a little bit worse, but that 4 power really means a lot, and it triggers a lot of these draw effects. Tribute to the World Tree is another 3 mana enchantment. Whenever a creature enters under your control, draw a card if it had 3 or more power. Otherwise, put 2/1/1 counters on it. Either way, you're getting stuff. Kiora, the Behemoth Beckoner, is a Planeswalker, 3 mana. It comes in with 7 counters, -1 untaps target permanent, which is kinda cool. But, of course, the main reason I'm using this is whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters under your control, guess what? You draw a card! It's pretty good. And, of course, what would my big stuff deck be without the Great Henge, which is worth 9? But it costs X less, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, so it typically costs quite a bit less. It taps for double green, and you gain 2 life, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card. This card is busted. It is loaded. It is ridiculous. It is also very expensive, but yeah, this card does everything. It's crazy. And finally, we have Rishkar's Expertise for 6 mana, so again, I think most of those things that care about casting large spells, they don't care if you're playing a creature or not, so this will trigger those 6-drop abilities. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, which can be massive. And then you get to cast a card with converted mana cost 5 or less from your hand without paying its cost. So you draw a ton of cards and you get something for free. There's no reason not to use this. It is a very, very powerful effect. Now let's take a look at the win conditions of this deck. Now, this is a land combo deck, which is something I've never done before with any of my other decks, so that's another reason why I built this deck the way I did. However, it is also a very complicated land combo deck that requires a lot of combo pieces. Not all of these, mind you, but these are all cards that you will probably want to play if you see them, and they go a long way to piecing together some sort of combo that you can work with. So, Patron of the Moon is one of the most important pieces. It's a 7-mana 5/4, has flying. It has Moonfolk Offering, which is irrelevant as I don't have any other Moonfolk, but for 1 mana, you put up to 2 land cards from your hand into play tapped. That is huge. That enables all sorts of crazy stuff to happen. And that is why you really, really want to see this card in play if you can. Ancient Green Warden is the other, I would say, most important combo piece in the deck. 6 mana, 5/7, it has reach. You can play lands from the graveyard, that is awesome, but the important thing is, if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Again, this makes ridiculous things happen and it causes your board to go absolutely insane. This is a very, very powerful card, and you want to play it if you can. Cloudstone Curio is sort of an artifact backup to Ancient Green Warden, 3 mana. Whenever a non-artifact permanent enters the battlefield under your control, return another permanent you control that shares a permanent type with it to its owner's hand. So, usually you do this with your lands, but you can do it with your creatures too if you want to reuse Topiary Stomper, I suppose. Mostly this is for your lands, and as I explain the combos later on, you will see why this is important. Tireless Provisioner is a very powerful card, 3 mana 3/2, Landfall. Whenever a land enters under your control, create a food or a treasure token. 99% of the time you are making treasure tokens because you want more mana to keep your combo going. And with just these cards that you've seen so far, you can probably see how this combo works, at least in part. Stone Cedar Hierophant is an interesting one. 4 mana is kind of a lot. It's a 1/1, which is kind of really tiny. But whenever a land comes into play, you untap this, and it taps to untap target land. So, if you can keep your lands going, you can keep on untapping them and creating more and more mana. So it just allows your plays to keep on going, probably forever. Retreat to Coral Helm is a 3 mana enchantment. Whenever a land enters under your control, choose 1. Tap or untap a creature, or scry 1. Both of those can be useful for different reasons. Typically, you are untapping one of your mana dorks or a Stone Cedar Hierophant like we just saw, so that you can untap even more lands and just keep on making mana. Tatiova, the Benthic Druid, is a 5 mana 3/3. Whenever a land enters under your control, gain a life and draw a card. That is important, because we've seen how we can keep on playing lands, and if we can keep on playing lands and making mana and drawing cards, yeah, you kind of just go crazy. AC, the Tyrant of Gyre Strait, is a 6 mana, very similar to Tatiova, 5/5. You can play an additional land on each of your turns, which is a nice bonus, but the main thing is, whenever a land enters under your control, you may draw a card, so just keep on drawing stuff, right? And remember, with that Ancient Green Warden, all of these triggered abilities would trigger an additional time. Rampaging Baloths is a 6-drop, 6/6 with Trample. Whenever a land enters, you make a 4/4 beast creature token. Now this is surprisingly important. Not just because you want to flood the field with 4/4s, but because so many of those draw effects don't care if the 4-power creature is a token or not. So this kind of functions as another whenever a land enters draw a card, as long as you have something that wants to see 4-power creatures enter the battlefield. It is a rather powerful effect as well. And finally, I mean, this is a card that literally says you win the game on it. We have Laboratory Maniac. 3 mana 2/2, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So, yeah, there you go. You would be surprised how easy it is to draw out your entire library in this deck. So that's why we have the old Lab Man here. We also have a handful of these, like, miscellaneous effects. I didn't really know where to put these. Fierce Empath is a 3 mana 1/1. Comes into play, search your library for a creature with converted mana cost 6 or more. Reveal it, put it into your hand, shuffle. So this gets a lot of relevant cards, a lot of your big combo pieces, and a lot of other things that I will go into in a bit more detail later on. It's a nice, versatile effect to have. Sort of like Tooth and Nail, which is 7 mana. You can entwine both of these abilities for 2 more to make it 9 mana. Search your library for up to 2 creature cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, shuffle, or put up to 2 creature cards from your hand onto the battlefield. So for 9 mana, you search for any 2 creatures, put them both into play. And 9 mana's a lot, granted. However, if those creatures are, like, 6, 7 mana, then you're actually getting a pretty good deal for 9. And you might just win the game right there and then if you're getting the 2 combo pieces that you need. And then there is the Conduit of Worlds, which is a 4 mana artifact. You can play lands from your graveyard, which is a handy ability. And you can tap it to choose a non-land permanent card in your graveyard, and if you haven't cast a spell this turn, you can cast it from your graveyard. But then you can't cast additional spells this turn, and you can only do this as a sorcery. So it's kind of a last resort type of thing. If you have absolutely nothing else to do, you can cast something from your graveyard. But just being able to play lands from your graveyard is, it's kind of huge, really, in this deck. And finally, we have a bit more removal, starting with some counterspells. Saw It Coming. This is a funny one. It's a 3 mana counterspell, but you can foretell it for 2, and then play it later for 2. So your opponent probably won't be expecting a 2 mana counterspell in this deck, so sometimes that happens. Otherwise, it's very... You can just play it for 3, that's not the worst thing, it still works. So it's kinda cool. Flare of Denial. You know all those creatures that I've been saying, this creature is blue, this'll be relevant later. This is why it's relevant. This is another 3 mana counterspell, but you can sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay this spell's mana cost, so you can play it for free, as long as you have a blue creature that's not doing much. Force of Negation is another 3 mana counterspell, but if it's not your turn, you can exile a blue card from your hand rather than pay this card's mana cost, so it's another sometimes free counterspell, as long as you have something blue, and yeah, you counter a non-creature spell. If it is countered this way, you exile it. Very powerful card. And then, of course, there is the ever-popular Force of Will, 5 mana counterspell. That's not great, but you can pay a life and exile a blue card from your hand. Yeah, there we go. Again, you need those blue cards. Rather than pay Force of Will's mana cost. This is a classic effect, but it's still a powerful one, it really is. And then we have Crush of Tentacles, a 6 mana, return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands, but its surge cost is 5, it might be a bit cheaper, and if its surge cost is paid, you also make an 8/8 octopus afterward. So usually I use this card instead of Cyclonic Rift because I don't like Cyclonic Rift, But I couldn't use Cyclonic Rift in this deck if I wanted to, so there you go, that's why we've got Crush of Tentacles. Now, because this is a land combo deck, as you can imagine, there's a lot of land in it. In fact, there are 43 lands, or land accessories, that I have in this pile right here. We are going to start with the double-sided, the MDFC flip lands here. So these are really cool because they're lands if you need them to be. Otherwise, they have other effects. They might be creatures, they might be instants or sorceries. It's good to have these. At the very least, in case of emergency, you can still use them as lands. So Drowner of Truth is a 7-mana 7/6 with Devoid. If you cast this spell with colorless mana, then you also create two 0/1 Eldrazi spawns that sacrifice to add colorless mana. Otherwise, it is a land that enters tapped and adds green or blue. So the land side is typically not great on any of these, but it's there if you need it. We also have a Bala Ged Recovery as a sorcery, 3 mana. You return a card from your graveyard to your hand, and the other side is a green land that enters tapped. Colony Ambush is an instant. Hey, this one's not bad. 3 mana. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. And the other side is a tapped green land. Bridgeworks Battle is a 3-mana sorcery, unfortunately, that gives target creature you control +2/+2, and it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. But the land can enter untapped if you pay 3 life, so hey, that is also something, even if it is only a sorcery. Disciple of Freyalise, here we've got a creature, 6 mana 3/3, but when it enters, you sacrifice another creature. If you do, gain X life and draw X cards where X is that creature's power. That can draw you a lot of cards if you have, you know, like the Beanstalk Giant or something with a lot of power. Otherwise, it's another one of these green lands that can enter untapped if you pay life. Turntimber Symbiosis is another one just like that. The land side can enter untapped for a few life, but otherwise it's a 7-mana sorcery. Look at the top 7 cards of your library, put a creature from among them onto the battlefield. If it had converted mana cost 3 or less, which is unlikely, it enters with 3 additional 1/1 counters on it, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So it's kind of fun sometimes to just flip the top 7 cards and see what you get. Maybe it is a desperate maneuver, but it is still a fun one. And then into the blue lands, we have Sink into Stupor, which is a 3-mana instant, return a spell or non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it's kind of a counterspell in a pinch. Otherwise, it is a land that can enter untapped. It taps for blue. If you pay 3 life, rather, it enters untapped. And Seagate Restoration is the last of these flip lands. 7 mana, draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand +1. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So this is a good way to go for the win with Laboratory Maniac. Otherwise, it is another one of these lands. It taps for blue, and it can enter untapped if you're willing to pay. And to finish off the main deck, we have all the other lands, which I will probably go through pretty quickly. Tropical Island is the classic dual land. It's a very expensive card, and you don't need it in your deck. It adds very minimal to how the deck functions. This might as well be a forest or an island, really. But I have one, so I use it. Breeding Pool is another dual land forest island, but it's the Shockland variety, so if you want it to come in untapped, you have to pay 2 life. Command Tower is the classic add mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Very good. Yavimaya Coast taps for colorless, or it taps for either color and does a damage to you. Rejuvenating Springs taps for either color, but only enters untapped if you have 2 or more opponents. Waterlogged Grove. You need to pay life to add your colored mana, but you can also sacrifice it to draw a card, which is nice. Dreamroot Cascade, taps for either color, enters tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. Hedge Maze, here's another dual land, but it always enters tapped, unfortunately, but when it does enter, you surveil 1, which is a very nice ability to have in the early turns when you probably aren't playing much more anyway. Hinterland Harbor taps for either color, but enters tapped unless you control a forest or an island. Doesn't have to be basic, though, so a tropical island counts, right? Yeah, that's money well spent. Flooded Grove taps for colorless, or you can turn a green or blue into 2 green, 2 blue, or 1 of each, which is cool. Lush Oasis, here we go. Believe it or not, this is kind of a win condition. You will see why when I go over the combos later. It enters tapped, but it is a desert, so you can search for it with some cards. And when it enters the battlefield, it does 1 damage to target opponent. Believe me, that means something. Simic Growth Chamber is the bounce land in the Simic colors. It comes into play tapped, and when it enters, you return a land you control to your hand. It taps for both green and blue at the same time, which is cool. But returning lands to your hand is, again, a very, very, very relevant ability. And then we get into some of the fetch lands. Misty Rainforest, tap, pay a life, search for a forest or island, put it onto the battlefield, doesn't have to be tapped, and then shuffle your library. So, yes, and it doesn't have to search for basics either, so this is another way to get some cool dual lands into play. Prismatic Vista, tap, pay a life, sacrifice it, search for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield untapped, shuffle your library. And Fabled Passage, tap it, sacrifice it, search for a basic land, put it into play tapped, shuffle your library, but if you control 4 or more lands, then you untap that land. So it's good in the later game too. Now, here we have a couple more channel lands. These are more sneaky ways to get some cool abilities that you can use from your hand. Otawara, the Soaring City, taps for blue, or you can discard it for a handful of mana to return an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. And this ability costs 1 less for each legendary creature you control. Good thing you have so many commanders. And Boseiju Who Endures is the green version of that. You discard it to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land an opponent controls, then that player may search their library for a land card with a basic land type and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle. So again, having these destruction effects on a channel ability is really cool, because most counterspells can't really interact with that since you aren't casting anything. You're just discarding something from your hand to activate an ability. And then we have the colorless lands. We have Ancient Tomb, which taps for double colorless and does 2 damage to you. It hurts, but it's worth it. Temple of the False God taps for 2 colorless mana, but only if you have 5 or more lands, which doesn't take very long in this deck. Field of the Dead is a cool one. It enters tapped, unfortunately, but it does tap for colorless mana, and whenever it or another land enters under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, which doesn't take long, you make a zombie token. So you're going to be making a lot of zombie tokens if you have Field of the Dead in play. Demolition Field is an interesting one. It taps for colorless, or you can sacrifice it to destroy a non-basic land an opponent controls, and then that land's controller can search their library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle, and then you also search for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield and shuffle. So this gets your land back, and it destroys something annoying of theirs. They get a land back as well, but hopefully whatever you destroyed was worth more to them than the basic land that they get instead. And Scavenger Grounds is another desert, which is cool. Taps for colorless, or you can sacrifice a desert, it doesn't have to be this one, to exile all cards from all graveyards. This is very, very powerful graveyard hate. And Yavimaya Hollow. You tap for a colorless mana, or for a green mana, you can regenerate target creature. It's nice to have on a land, it really is. It comes in handy. And then we have a couple more deserts. The Sun-Scorched Desert, which when it enters, it does a damage to target player. Ho ho ho, that damage. And it taps for colorless. And Arid Archway, which is a very powerful desert from modern sets. It enters tapped. Now, well, it's another bounce land, really. When it enters, you return another land to its owner's hand, that you control, of course. And if another desert was returned this way, you surveil one. So, I guess that happens sometimes, but mostly this is just used for its bouncing effect. And then we have the basics. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 forests. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 islands. This deck does run out of basics, like every time I play it. So if you wanted to not use so many dual lands, it's a good idea to use more basics. Yeah, I mean, I always get away with using just these 10, but it's really not a bad idea at all to bump that up to 12 or 14 or however many you want, because, yeah, you're gonna be searching for a lot of basics. Now, before I get into the combo section of this video, I do have a couple honorable mentions to go over. Now, normally the honorable mentions are things that I reserve for my Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck profiles, because this is a commander deck, and I could talk for days about all of the cards that I wanted to use but couldn't. But I think these ones are really worth talking about. This is Sakashima of 1,000 Faces and Kodama of the East Tree. So these are alternate commanders to the ones that I actually use. So, Sakashima, what it does is, it enters as a copy of another creature you control, except it still has Sakashima's other abilities, and the legend rule no longer applies to your permanent, so you can make Sakashima a copy of another legendary creature. And Kodama of the East Tree is it is a 6-drop, 6/6 with reach, but the important thing is whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, any permanent, a creature, a land, an artifact, a token, anything, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you can put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. So, oh yeah, Sakashima's 4 mana 3/1 if it's relevant. But what this means is that if you play a land from your hand, then that will trigger Kodama and you can put another land into play. So it is absolutely busted, actually, Kodama's ability. I guess it doesn't only work with lands, right? You can anything, right? You put a creature into play, then you get a free anything. It is ridiculous what this card does. So, if you want to play a better version of this deck, I would say, because I think I am playing purposely on hard mode with the loadout that I have put together. If you want to play a better version of this deck and have an easier time doing it, you would play it with these 2 commanders instead of whatever it is I'm doing. And then you could also focus less on 6-drops and more on creatures that give you free stuff when they enter the battlefield, because that will also trigger Kodama again, because this ability is not balanced in even the slightest way. Also, having these 2 as your commanders means that you don't really have the cool toolbox abilities in the command zone, but instead you have literal win conditions in the command zone. So, when I go over the combo for this deck, the main combo, what you're trying to do, I'll also, just for you, I'll also go over how these 2 go together to win the game, just in case you want to use them instead. Alrighty, so now let's take a look at how we might want to play some of the cards in this deck. Now, I've said it once, and I'll say it again, I think it bears repeating. One of the strengths of this deck is the fact that it has such a crowded command zone with its 2 partners and companion there. You always have access to these resources, so it is best if you use them. If you need extra mana, you have Galanra. If you need some kind of removal, you have Brynolin. If you need new cards in hand, you have Keruga. And, of course, Keruga is the companion, so there's that extra hoop that you have to jump through. You have to pay 3 mana just to add it to your hand to begin with, and then you can cast it from there. But still, it's a very powerful ability to just have at any time. You can access it once, so don't just leave these sitting in the command zone if you think you can use them. Especially Galanra at 3 mana is very likely to see play in pretty much any game that you're playing. You can always use more mana. And at 3 mana to cast, this is quite likely to just be played right away on turn 3 as soon as you can. So now that that little introduction is out of the way, let's take a look at the combo. So the one card that makes the entire combo work is your Patron of the Moon. This card is absolutely vital, and we really need it at any cost. And in addition to that, we need some way of doubling a certain trigger that will happen later on. Ancient Green Warden is great for that, because it just doubles all sorts of triggers when lands enter, but Cloudstone Curio works just as well, at least in this one case. So this is a good backup if something happens to your Ancient Green Warden. Also, we need some way to turn lands entering the battlefield into mana. So Tireless Provisioner does this very well, just making those treasure tokens, and the Stone Cedar Hierophant also works, since she can untap a land anytime a land comes into play. So yes, those are, again, sort of redundant copies. Now, what do we do with all of this, right? With this we can play a lot of lands, but this doesn't really win you the game, now does it? Well, here's how that works. Say we have 2 very specific lands. We have a Lush Oasis, and we have the Arid Archway. Now, these are both deserts, so you can actually search them out pretty easily with Map the Frontier. This will pull both of them for you. And here's how the combo works. So Arid Archway enters the battlefield, and when it does, it will return a land you control to your hand. But if we have the Ancient Green Warden in play, or the Cloudstone Curio, that pretty much happens twice. So we can return Arid Archway to our hand, we can also return this Lush Oasis to our hand. But, because those 2 lands entered the battlefield to begin with, or at least one of them did, then we can also use that mana that we can generate from that happening, either a treasure token or untapping another land or both, to pay the 1 mana that we need to put these 2 lands back into play tapped, which will, of course, trigger Arid Archway twice, and trigger these twice to get more mana. So we are bouncing the Arid Archway and the Lush Oasis over and over and over again, an infinite amount of times, in fact, dealing 1 damage to target opponent infinitely to win the game. That is the combo. And we do have a bit of redundancy in the lands as well, right? Simic Growth Chamber will work just as well as the Archway, and Sunscorched Desert is another desert that does a damage when it enters, so in case something weird happens to one of these, or just depending on what you find first, you have a couple options. Also, don't forget, we have Tooth and Nail, which will pull any 2 creatures from your library and put them right into play, so this also goes a long way to assembling this admittedly convoluted combo and getting you the win from there. Now, as promised, let's see how a similar combo would work with Kodama of the East Tree and Sakashima of a Thousand Faces, because, yes, it is a similar combo, but it works actually much, much better. So if you have Kodama of the East Tree in play, you have Sakashima of a Thousand Faces copying Kodama of the East Tree, now all you really need is some way of doubling those landfall or anti-landfall, land-bouncing triggers, like with Ancient Green Warden. Cloudstone Curio, of course, still works, but in this case we don't need Patron of the Moon at all. You can take this out of your deck, you can replace it with something different, whatever. So, how this ends up working is you play your Arid Archway, you have your Lush Oasis in play, or you play them both at the same time, or play them with Kodama's ability, whatever. Again, Kodama of the East Tree is not even in the vicinity of being a fair and balanced card. It is busted. So, Arid Archway enters, you return both of these to your hand. Kodama of the East Tree and Sakashima both saw that Arid Archway entered the battlefield, so they will both try to put a land from your hand into play, or, well, anything with 0 mana cost, I guess, which is pretty much a land. So, they will each put a land from your hand into play. It doesn't target what is in your hand, of course, you don't choose until this resolves. So, as long as you return your lands first, then, well, you can just put them both back into play. And then this Kodama will see, well, say you put Lush Oasis in with Kodama, you put the Archway in with Sakashima. Kodama will see that Arid Archway entered not from its ability. Sakashima will see that Lush Oasis entered not from its ability. So when these inevitably bounce themselves back to your hand, they will each trigger again based on the land that the other one put into play. So then you put them both into play, and then these both trigger again, and then these both trigger again, and then you put them both into play, and that is how it works. That is a much more streamlined and concise way to do this. Same combo, with commanders who are themselves your combo pieces, so you always have access to them. But again, I don't like this version of the deck as much because it feels a little bit too easy, and I would rather do things the hard and convoluted way and need a silly 5-piece combo that I need to dig out of the deck. But if you want to build a good deck and win, then by all means do this. It's not like the other version of this deck is bad, it's actually still quite good, and it is rather consistent at that. But this is just better and more consistent. So yeah, there you go. That is the alternate way to play this deck. Now, before I wrap this up, I just wanted to go over some of the fun things that you can do with Fierce Empath. So Fierce Empath, of course, comes into play, and you search your library for a creature with mana value 6 or more, and add it to your hand. However, that means that you can find some interesting things. For example, if you need a land drop, because for some reason you don't have any more land in your hand, you can search for a Drowner of Truth, which is a 7-drop creature, but on the other side, it is a land. So that's kinda cool. Similar with Disciple of Freyalise, you can just search for this, and you practically get a forest out of the deal, or you can use it to just draw cards and stuff, which is also handy to have. Speaking of lands and land-type things, we have the Beanstalk Giant, another 7-drop, so easily searchable with Fierce Empath, but Fertile Footsteps is a 3-mana sorcery that comes attached, and the land that it searches for doesn't even enter tapped, so it's kind of like it's a 2-mana sorcery, really. And of course you can even pull some removal, like Stormkeld Vanguard, which is a 6-drop, but Bear Down is a 2-mana sorcery that destroys something, which is nice. Same with Colossal Sky Turtle, a big 7-drop. but you can kind of just use this as like an eternal witness to bring something back to your hand, or you just return a target creature to its owner's hand with the other channel ability. So there's all sorts of stuff that you can get with Fierce Empath, besides, you know, your combo pieces, right? I imagine that's often what you'll be looking for, but if you're creative, you can find other answers to other problems as well. Alright, and there ends my Keruga the Macro Sage Big Stuff / Land Combo deck profile video. Now, this deck really was a combination of a number of things that I've never really done before in my commander decks, but things that I really wanted to do eventually, so I'm glad that I've finally been able to cross some of those things off of my checklist, and the result is this deck that really is a lot of fun, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, I would say that this deck is actually pretty good. It creates this sort of gameplay loop that's a lot of fun to mess around with as you, like, play more stuff, to draw more cards, to play extra lands, which generates all sorts of extra value for you, and eventually it all culminates into a board state that's maybe difficult for your opponents to deal with. And even if they can deal with it somehow, hopefully you've been able to ramp enough that you can recover in a short amount of time. There's certainly enough lands in this deck to be able to do that. And even with the sort of watered-down commander loadout here, I would say I actually prefer these two over Sakashima and Kodama of the East Tree, because with the deck like this, it requires a lot more out of the player, because you need to know better what the deck is capable of and how to play it, how to pilot it properly, since half of your combo pieces aren't readily available in the command zone. So, yeah, you've got to use all of the resources that are available to you to build this ridiculous combo on your own, which is a lot of fun to do. It's a cool little, I guess you could almost call it a mini-game that you need to assemble throughout the course of your match. But this will bring me to the end of today's deck profile video, and I do hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, then please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, and let me know if you found this even just the smallest bit helpful, or as the case may be, a massive bit helpful. And till next time, ta-ta. Oh, good heavens, look! We got a collector's rare. Excuse me a moment. Oh, hello! I like it, I do. I was worried for a second that this box was going to be suboptimal. Oh, goodness, that is a pull right there. Let's find out. Oh, boy.